They say history is written by the victors, but what if the truth was buried with the fallen? Every secret leaves a trace, if you know where to look. This is The Broken Truth, decoding history, one broadcast at a time. The Broken Truth Podcast, where history meets conspiracy. Every case tells a story. Every story hides a lie. Welcome back to the Broken Truth Podcast. I'm your host, Garrett. So the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, the verse that split scholars for centuries. Were these beings divine rebels, genetic engineers, or something far older than history allows? Tonight, we're joined by JTfollowsJC, a creator whose work blends biblical truth and hidden history. JT, welcome to the Broken Truth Podcast.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
No, of course. Thanks for coming on. We appreciate it. We're going to dive into the topic of the Genesis 6 conspiracy today, probably one of my favorite topics to cover. I think it's a really good foundation for those who may not really be interested in conspiracy as a whole, but also those with the religious framework, such as yourself, as it gives a lot of context as to the hidden mysteries that the Bible has.
Yeah, for sure. This is definitely one of my favorite topics. Kind of one of my first real big topics of focus when I first got on social media. Because like a lot of people, when you're first pointed to chapter 6 in the book of Genesis, you're like, what is a Nephilim? What is this about? I have no idea. How did I ever miss this going to church and going to Christian schools? It just blew me away about that angels had offspring that became giants and the heroes of old and the men of renown. And I could not believe, as somebody who read comic books my whole life, that I was like, wait a minute, is this like the story of Thor and
This
the
is
Greek
real?
gods? Yeah, that's what I was. And yeah, so when I first kind of discovered that, I was really kind of obsessed with it, and I was definitely reading the scriptures over again in the Old Testament and really trying to dial in on any time they talked about tribes of giants and things like that. And I was just like, I was so fascinated. So then I was continuing to dig in. And we just talked off air. I bought Gary Wayne's book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and I've listened to so many podcasts and just watched so many different YouTube videos about this subject. And eventually, myself and my good friend Brian, who goes by Demon Racers on social media, we actually went on to make a documentary movie called Ancient Angels. So it was like a play on. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, that is awesome. Where can you find that?
It's on Vimeo. I can send you the links for it. Yeah, you can check it out. Yeah, we did that 2 years ago now. Yeah,
Okay.
but it was funny because I've talked about a lot more things now. But yeah, for a while I was doing the podcast circuit, just talking all about the sons of God and the Nephilim and the giants and all that stuff.
No, that's awesome. It's interesting because the whole concept of Genesis 6 seems to be, well, it was removed from the Bible, essentially, at least the conspiratorial aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it ties into a lot of the book of Enoch. But it's from a historical perspective and a faith-based perspective, a lot of people understand the flood or the deluge to have happened because of man's turn from
Mm-hmm.
like betrayal of God, right? We were told not to eat from the tree of life. We decided to do so, and then the flood comes about. But what a lot is not talked about is the whole concept that the Watchers came down. They completely disregarded the law of God and saying not to procreate with man. They did. Now we have this concept that there's a hybrid being, now like a half angel, half human race that lingers between the earth, and this is anti-deluge. And it's interesting because supposedly the flood wiped them out, but now there's the conspiratorial aspect that they do linger within us.
Right. Well, I mean that's what this text says is, and I believe that's what it's indicating when it's saying. It says the Nephilim were in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore to them giants who were the heroes of old, the men of renown. So when it says before and afterwards, it's indicating that they after the flood, because what Genesis 6 is kind of like it's obviously the lead up to the deluge, and it's what why God's heart's grieved, why he regrets making man, why he limits men's lives to 120 years. And then this is the story. And then it later goes on to say that Noah was pure in his generations, or perfect in his generations. And I think that that's a very key verse, meaning that it's talking about genetic corruption. It's talking about the sons of God mingling their DNA and their seed with the daughters of men. But then when it says Noah was pure in his generation or perfect, it doesn't mean he was like Jesus. I think what it's saying is that he was perfect in his generations back to the first man, who was Adam. And then there's all these other people who are not. And it actually even says in the text, it says that all flesh had corrupted its way on the earth. So I mean,
Mm.
that's indicating, yeah, that if you read into the apocryphal text like the book of Enoch, it mentions that the angels sinned against women, sinned against themselves, sinned against the animals, sinned against the birds, sinned against the fish of the sea and all the creeping things. So yeah, you can imagine what God really intended when he created everything. There was a bunch of things that he did not intend. And it makes sense to
Absolutely.
me that yeah, like if you get your normal Sunday school lesson about why God decided to destroy the earth. I mean, it's like it's hard. I guess it's hard for us to even kind of wrap our minds around that God created everything and then he said, I wish I didn't create any of this stuff and I'm going to destroy it all. So it's more than just people being bad. To set, like it's that's like the Sunday school lesson. It's like that. It does say in the text that the desires of men's heart were like evil all the time. But at the same time, like there's been pockets of people that God has preserved, and it's like to only preserve 8 people after of all of creation, and to destroy the earth and everything that resides on the earth is very extreme. So, I
That is
mean, God had a
wild.
good reason for it, and God is just, so he wouldn't have done that if there was a possibility of redeeming them.
And then he goes on to say that he'll never wipe out the earth by flood again. But
Mhm.
then we go to Revelation, and Revelation tells that once we get into, I mean, for saving time at least, our era now, that it's going to be burnt by fire.
Right, right. Well, I mean, some people have yeah. I've talked a little bit more about that recently in my podcast where I think some of that stuff has already happened, but yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about that? Like in terms of tying it into Revelation, because honestly, there's a lot that seems like it's really happening now.
Well, actually, I believe that a lot of this stuff happened around shortly after Jesus' ministry, after his ascension. I believe that there's a lot of evidence around the world that there have been lots of things burned up by fire, and if you get into the kind of weirder conspiracies about the mud flood and all that kind of stuff, I believe that that's evidence that we're living past that time. I
Huh.
don't know if you've listened to what I've talked about lately, but yeah, we talk a little bit about Satan's little seeds, but we don't have to really get into that today. But
No, I'll have to dig more into that.
yeah,
That's
no, yeah,
definitely something that's
that's
interesting.
that's a whole different conversation. That's a long conversation, but no, but it is interesting. I think that the thing that I really maybe the thing that got me really excited about discovering Genesis 6 in the book of Enoch was the fact that, as you can probably tell by the title of our movie, it was called Ancient Angels, which is clearly a play on ancient aliens. And so before I ever really got into conspiratorial content or making content, period, I was watching that show on the History Channel. And as a Christian and a Bible believer, I didn't believe in aliens. But I was really fascinated with the questions about the megalithic structures. And then, you go on and listen to Joe Rogan, who has Graham Hancock on there, like John Anthony West, a lot of really interesting kind of alternative history theorists, you per se. And
Yeah, yeah.
they're discussing the megaliths. And I think that was the thing that really kind of just I could not place that because I never learned about all the different pyramids and all the megalithic stone structures all over the earth that seem like they're the oldest things that exist. So I mean that part of your brain says, well, is there a biblical answer for this? Because these guys are not giving us a biblical. They're talking about things that happened before the last ice age and tens and 20 and 26,000 years ago and potentially longer back than that. And I was a little troubled in my faith by those questions because I was like, doesn't the Bible have answers for this stuff? If they go all the way back to Adam, it's kind of weird that there's this time where all this weird stuff is happening and the Bible makes no mention of it. But then I started to connect the dots between, yeah, if you read the book of Enoch, it does mention that these watchers, besides taking wives of the daughters of men, they taught men all kinds of technology. And I thought, wait a minute, so that might explain it. And it makes sense that when you do hear the myths that they repeat in Ancient Aliens, it's always about gods coming down from heaven. It's talking about giants. And those are usually the two kind of entities that are credited with the things that no one can explain. And I'm
Yeah.
like, wait a minute. So the Bible actually does explain that. It's more like I think in Genesis 6, the Bible is not a history of everything that ever happened. It's like these books or these scrolls and letters were written to people that already have an understanding at the time. So it's kind of like the Genesis 6 account is very short when it's talking about the story about the sons of God and the Nephilim.
Yeah.
But like this story is known.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that that's the thing that kind of encouraged me later when I did start to see that. I'm like, wait a minute, all these mythologies all around the whole earth are basically telling the same story, but it's from a different perspective, which makes sense if you think about the story of the Tower of Babel and you have different languages. So the story of like gods from heaven, giants, and a flood is is a worldwide story.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think it makes sense. And if obviously the Bible's true, then that would likely be the case because you have 8 people get off the ark and the story is not going to be forgotten. So everybody
Absolutely.
repeats it over and over again.
It's interesting you mentioned that because that's honestly what challenges my faith. I think most extreme, and even to this day, is the concept that all the mythology and religion as a whole, whether it be um, Muslims, Jews, Christians, whatever, all the doctrine from like a foundation level is the same. But like you said, it's just from different perspectives.
Hmm.
At least from like the very foundation, and then it kind of stems off into some other stuff. But yeah, they have different characters, different titles that they give it, but the story at a base level is all the same. And you mentioned something that I found really interesting. You said Ancient Aliens, and
Hmm.
that's why you named uh, the movie that you guys did. So with the concept of the delusion, and everything, you had the Amaka Sethites that were created, or at least biblically, it says from within a cloud. And yeah, from within a cloud. And the way that Gary Wayne from the Genesis 6 conspiracy would put this is he considers that to be created within a cloud from extraterrestrial life or God, as believers would put it. Um, but do you think there could be some tie to ancient aliens, like actually,
Well,
biblically?
I would just say biblically, I would say that you could list an angel as an extraterrestrial because they're not from here. It says in Job 38 that the morning stars, the sons of God, were shouting for joy when God was laying the foundations of the earth. So they're not they weren't their origin is not here. Their origin is from the heavens. Now, kind of just, not to spoil the movie too much, but you guys
Yeah,
will
yeah,
get
yeah.
the hint, is that my grand, like overall take on this ancient alien story was that I believe that this alien deception is something that's been run rampant in the culture and it's kind of being fused into it's a story that now it's like a predictive programming. So if there's any kind of alien threat, people are already primed for it. They've seen it in the movies, they've read it in the comic books, they've heard it on the radio. This is a story that we think is old now, but it's really new as far as like the big introduction to this was probably like the War of the Worlds. And so I believe stories, shows like Ancient Aliens, they ask good questions, but their conclusions are ridiculous. But what I think that they're trying to do is they're trying to write aliens or extraterrestrials back into our past. So it makes it seem like oh, this was always the case, even though those
Interesting.
peoples they didn't talk about them coming from other planets. They would say, so if you could say today they came from space, but you're like, but the people there would say they came from heaven. So the
Ah,
point is that even in, like modern kind of sci-fi movies would indicate that if an alien from another place came here, he would obviously be more advanced than us because we can't travel to the places where he's from. So the point is these beings are superior to us and then they have the ability and think about movies like Prometheus where they're literally like the ones who seeded humanity. And so
interesting.
this story kind of sounds similar to what like Zachariah Sitchin would have said about the Anunnaki. is these Anunnaki were these gods from Nibiru, and they came here, and then they basically genetically modified some kind of primate to make us, to end up mining for gold and doing that kind of stuff. So it's like this idea that these extraterrestrials that the Sumerians wrote about were not really gods; they were just different beings from other worlds. And so I think that if you're more faithful to what the ancient peoples wrote about in their mythologies, it lines closer up to what the biblical text says. Is
Yeah.
that these were gods, and I believe, I think there's a lot of evidence, especially biblically, that the other gods of the other religions are real entities. They're false gods as far as like that we know there's one creator that created everything. And I believe he created little g gods, and these little g gods are the heavenly hosts. Because the Bible even
Mm.
indicates that some of the evil kings of Judah and also Israel, they worship the whole heavenly host. So then if you think about these religions with all these pantheon of gods, is that just another are these just avatars for angels? They
Hmm.
appear to these people as Zeus or Anubis or Horus or Athena, but what if those are just angels? And I think that's likely the case.
Interesting. So it almost sounds that even with all this stuff that people would conspiracy or stuff to not be talked about, at least on the grand scale, right? Especially from a religious base, it almost strengthens the foundation of your beliefs.
Oh yeah, no question. I think that's why I really liked, kind of going down this rabbit hole because I thought things make more sense. I think one thing that when somebody tied that kind of verse when it talks about that these giants, these Nephilim, were the heroes of old, the men of renown. Instantly in my mind, I thought, are they talking about like Hercules? And so when I was kind of tying that into Greek and Roman mythology, I thought, you know what, it just something resonated about it to me that would these stories really continue today if they were totally made up? So it's not saying Greek mythology is fact by any means,
Yeah, yeah,
but it's saying like that this is a story. And of course, mythologies to the Greeks were not just fiction. They were oral traditions passed down, meant to tell a lot of times moral tales and to pass down history. So of course, from their perspective, the story is going to be, who knows, depending on who's telling the story. But I thought it's really interesting that even in a lot of those stories in like the Greek pantheon, those gods were never good. They were all really flawed.
yeah.
And same thing in the Egyptian mythologies. All these gods had massive character flaws, and they could be evil at times. They could be malevolent, but sometimes they would be good to the people. And I thought
Absolutely,
that sounds kind of like what you describe as like an angel, kind of a fallen angel, where
absolutely.
they could do good for you. Kind of like the story of Satan taking Jesus up to a high mountain and offering him all the kingdoms of the world. So if your goal is fleshly things, that they most certainly can give that, because that goes all even back to the book of Enoch, because they taught men how to make weapons of war. They taught them how to do witchcraft. They taught them astrology. They taught them all kinds of knowledge of things that they had no idea about. And that answers a lot of questions about how did men ever learn how to do some of these? And it makes sense that gods from the heaven told them. God, these heavenly hosts who were watching God create things on earth, they would have had knowledge of all kinds of things. And so they would have been able to certainly give people tangible knowledge of things.
Well, then you even have, like we were talking about in the Book of Enoch, or the redacted Book of Enoch, the seven mystical sciences, and yeah, they were
Hmm.
passed down from the gods and supposedly now protected by our elites or whatever you want to call them, the shadows. So, why do you think that this mainstream theology now kind of avoids or downplays the Nephilim narrative as a whole?
I mean, that's a great question. I guess the thing is, it's that Christianity has a certain supernatural belief that's acceptable crazy. Because obviously believing the story of Christ is from a very fleshly perspective, it seems unbelievable because it is the greatest story ever told, right? But
Yeah,
but there's lots of things in the Bible that are really crazy. They're crazy kind of in the church. And I think maybe it's an idea of like that certain mainstream Christians, they try to use the science as we know it, and then they try to explain the Bible that fits into the scientific paradigm we have. But there's many things in the Bible that are just spiritual things that are miracles. It's like it's hard for us to wrap our minds around. And so yeah, I believe that kind of the alternate view of Genesis 6 is that the sons of God were not actually angels. They weren't divine beings. They were sons of Seth. So sons of God being like they were in the godly line of Adam to Seth, and then they were good men, and they were corrupted by perhaps like the daughters of Cain through like immorality, something like that. But
Uh,
but the text really does. I mean, the text is actually pretty clear when you see it. Like the term "sons of God," every time it's used in the Old Testament, is referring to heavenly beings. And then so by contrast, when you get to the New Testament, when you're in Christ and when you receive your resurrected body, you'll be sons of God. So it's like Jesus tells the Pharisees that we'll be like the angels in heaven in the resurrection. And so we're not all sons of God, right? But spiritually, when we're in Christ, we are. But that's a different thing. Like that was like a new concept that we have the right to be called sons of God because you're put in this heavenly family. And I believe what kind of the sons of God term directly means is that you have sons of men. Even Jesus was called the son of man. You know, Ezekiel's called the son of man because he was born of a woman. He was not a direct creation. Of course, Jesus, this is in his earthly form. He was not a creation either. But what it's saying is like that if you even trace back the lineages in the Gospels of Matthew, it's saying this was son of so and so, this was son of so and so, and then you get all the way back to Adam, who was a son of God. And if you think because Adam was a direct creation from God, you know, he had no mother. So I would say that that's exactly what these heavenly hosts were. They were sons of God. So yeah,
Interesting.
the question is, why do they try to write that off? I don't know. I mean, I think that again, that's probably when you get into like Gary Wayne's book and you talk about the Genesis 6 conspiracy. Like it's certain people certainly believe this, and I think biblically it's accurate. But maybe it's kind of a mystery school thing. Like they don't want normal people to know that.
And that could make sense. I mean, they do time and time again try to cover up the whole concept of extraterrestrial life within like every three-letter agency or anything. They've been trying to bury this forever. And they
Right.
get
Well, now it's interesting. The more interesting part now is now that there there is this process of disclosure where they do seem like that they were emitting things that they once denied for years and years and years. Like this UAP or UFO phenomenon is real now, and then they're going as far to say that there's non-human biologics found in craft that's not from here and things like that. So that's why I'm saying it seems like that they are setting people up for this potential deception of like what is next. And then I recently just played a clip from it was Paulina Luna. I guess she was doing a podcast with Patrick Beck David, and she was even referenced in an older podcast she did with Rogan. And she was mentioning, yeah, these UAPs are real. She's seen like the skiff reports on them, and these crafts are real. And it's
Hmm.
really wild. It's like what are they trying to say? But what really kind of perked my ears up when she was talking was she was saying that the people who have the closest contact with this stuff, they believe that these are not actually they're not from outer space, they're interdimensional beings. And they could be referring to ancient texts like the ones that were removed from the Bible, and she specifically mentions the book of Enoch. And
Huh.
I'm like, that is it almost feels like that's bait, you know, like it's almost so much where like us conspiracy theorists would be like, they're lying, they're lying, they're lying about denying all these interdimensional or UFO phenomenon. Then they started admitting, and it's like now we know they're still lying, but we're not exactly sure why they're lying now.
Yeah, it's like why give us tidbits, bits and pieces just to like keep us on edge and then not give us
Hmm.
the full truth. Like in the end, why would it matter? Like there's a handful of us that believe it wholeheartedly. And honestly, from your perspective, that really does, even for me, strengthen my foundation from a religious perspective. Now that you gave me that kind of context, I never thought of it that way. Um, but yeah, what harm would it do for any of us to know the full truth or understand any of this? Especially in a world today where it's like, I don't necessarily think we'd be terrified of it, like by any means.
Well, I think that the just from a like a biblical straight textual understanding, I think Christians would have to wrestle with the idea of like who are these aliens? So that's why I would say that from my perspective, I would say that it is a spiritual phenomenon. I mean, I would say that yeah, again, aliens and angels are really just kind of descriptions of things. They're not. It's not a definition of a being. It's like it's
Yeah,
what we're really saying is an angel's a messenger, an alien is somebody from not here. And so I think that people have to kind of wrestle around in their biblical paradigm if that fits. So that
mm,
first and foremost, I would say that the truth is we really don't know. Like we really don't know what they are. But obviously the Bible does give room that there's other beings and even what we perceive to be a biblical angel, a lot of times they're described in the Bible as just men. But I believe that angels are spirit, they can take different forms. So if you saw something that did not obey the laws of physics as we know them, some kind of a craft, or we think it's a craft, well, obviously, wouldn't it just by definition be supernatural because it doesn't obey the laws of physics?
absolutely.
So the truth is, again, the Bible is not a story that tells you every true thing that ever happened and every true thing that is. Otherwise, the book would be too long and you'd miss the point. So there's a lot of room for things to be true outside of this story. But I would say that from a Christian, I would say I'm comforted in is the fact that humanity is unique. We're made in God's image, and then He sent His Son to die for us. So He says in Hebrews that He did not send His Son to die for the angels. So who are these other phenomena? Well, I think that
Hmm.
if they weren't nefarious beings, well, then they might likely introduce themselves to us, or maybe they can't. If they are, maybe the angels are not obviously supposed to intervene, thus almost be given that title of watchers, that they're really not supposed to interfere. They're supposed to do things behind the scenes.
And
So
what if they are lingering within our society and we just don't know? Because, like you said, maybe they can't really introduce themselves to us formally.
right. Well, it seemed like that's in the antediluvian times they did, and that was part of their judgment. It was they can't really do that again. And I do believe that the devil, being one of the most powerful angels who fell, if not the most powerful one that fell, he operates through deception. So I think that this whole kind of idea of like, what are they? Well, whether you're kind of into like the scientism class or science fiction, well, alien's a comfortable idea for you. But if you're a Christian, it's like, well, then it's all demons or angels. But maybe there is room for something in the middle of that. Because I've long suspected that what if things that from the antediluvian times or even like remnants afterwards could have been left over as kind of holdovers that were some kind of I don't know, fleshly abomination that do live inside the earth and come from places that are here in this
Yeah.
in this contained environment we're at. But this earth and the oceans and the things under the earth, there's a lot of room for all kinds of things to be true. And yeah, it could be a combination of these are spirits that were possessing potentially flesh suits and things like that. Is that kind of could that be the gray alien phenomenon? I mean,
Interesting.
like I said, it's really hard to say.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely hard to say. Uh, wow. Huh. So we have the whole thing that this stuff was taught to humanity: the metallurgy, the weapons, cosmetics, astrology. Um, do you think that any of this could be like relating to the transfer of knowledge related to AI but in our modern era?
Oh, most certainly. Yeah, I would say there's a lot of technology that it does seem almost inhuman when you talk about like quantum computers and things like that and AI. It's, I mean, I don't want to take credit away from men's ingenuity,
Yeah.
but some of this stuff feels like somebody got help. Even if you think about kind of the stories of Nikola Tesla, whether they're true or not, he claimed to get dreams and visions of full inventions, like in his mind, like plans for them, and he would write them out after. I mean, it's kind of like where do we get our ideas from? How influenced are we by the spiritual realm? Of course, in the mythos and kind of the movies, is often that, kind of the conspiracy theories about like Area 51, that there was a spacecraft crashes, and then government hides it, and then they reverse engineer lots of this stuff. I often wonder that what if some of the stuff that was antediluvian, or maybe even afterwards, it's hard to say. What if they did find advanced kind of ancient tech and they've reverse engineered some of this stuff? Or it's
You
also
even
possible. It's also possible, yeah, that these beings who can appear to be men do come right out and just give people the ideas. Have you ever seen the movie The Eternals?
yeah,
So I think that movie is very clearly on the nose of like this is the story of the Watchers, these Eternals, these superheroes, all in tights, but they have different kinds of abilities. And I can't remember exactly what the character's name was, but one of them was given men the idea for invention. And I
absolutely.
think that it's like, yeah, I think yeah, that people have had help, and I think they've had help all along.
That could tie directly into the whole shadow realm of protected knowledge, and that it is and was and still is passed on.
Hmm.
Huh. Crazy. Wow. So, if angels tampered with creation once, do you think they could do it again? Do you think they are doing it through science? Or the Nephilim lingering within our realm?
I would say that if they had the ability to do it before, yes, they could do it again. The real question is, would they do it again?
Mm,
I've my conclusion has always been, at least this is my current working one, is that when you go back to Genesis 6, it said the Nephilim were in those days and also after when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. So I believe if they came before from coming into the daughters of men, I believe that it's likely they did it again. And I think that from my perspective, I thought that you could have had a big incursion of the Watchers. They said, 200 Watchers descended upon Mount Hermon before the flood. And then you had, obviously, to a level of just like, we can't even probably wrap our minds around, we probably wouldn't even want to, how bad it was, of the different races of giants and them breeding together and then the genetic corruption that proceeded after that, that it was on a level. And that's why a lot of the mythologies would be that the giants before the flood were super big. They were nothing like the ones that are described, like Goliath being 9 foot tall. But it is interesting to think that you have, after the flood, the land of Canaan has all these fortified cities and got all these giants there. So where did they come from? So I was wondering if it's possible that after the flood, you kind of have this old pantheon of gods in the mythologies, like kind of think like the Titans in Greek mythology, and then they're all down in the earth,
yeah.
just like what's talked about as that Peter mentions that these angels who sin were locked up in Tartarus. Well, that's the Greek word for where the Titans were at. So like the big bads like Kronos and some of the other ones from before the flood. And then you have this new pantheon who's ruled by Zeus. Well, I think there's strong indications through, I want to say, Revelation chapter 2. Pergamos was where Jesus said that's where Satan's throne was. Well, Satan's throne likely was what people think was the altar to Zeus. There was this famous altar temple complex. And if you look at it, it actually looks like a throne. So with that idea, what if the devil literally is Zeus? And then so the stories of Zeus is that he did procreate with lots of women on the earth and he set
Huh.
up these demigods. And that's where you get the mythologies about people like Hercules. So what
Wow.
if when you see the kind of like the pantheon later, you see like in ancient Egypt, you'd have had Horus, Isis, and the father would be Osiris. And then so like in the Greek mythology, of course, Zeus had many sons, but then he had his I think it was Terra was his wife, I believe, and then but then he had Apollo with a different woman, and then he had Hercules with a different woman, and so like, but there's still kind of like this head god, and then there's all these lesser gods who are under him. So I kind of thought, what if that's the story? Is that after the Watchers got locked up, the only plan they had to do it again. Like and so the devil was willing to kind of go out on a limb because the story's kind of already written. So like he has
Yeah.
no other option. So I thought maybe that's what's happening is that the devil was the one who really, made the last step after the flood. Because you think about the original prophecy in the Bible is that Eve's seed is going to crush the head of the serpent's seed. So if the serpent didn't have a seed, well then that prophecy doesn't make sense. So I'd say that he did. And that's why
Huh.
that there's but there was less of the Nephilim. There was less giants, so they weren't able to kind of procreate and still kind of maintain the power that they once had before the flood.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it's really wild how it kind of diversified and spread. Um, and back to the concept of like the big G and then all the little G's, kind of like you're referring to. It's almost like Zeus, or as you're referring to, being the big G god in terms of the heavenly power, and
Hmm.
then all the little G gods in terms of the satanic area, the evil that were
Hmm.
spread around. Ah, that's wild. So there's the thought that the Nephilim bloodlines may be connected to like higher powers today, and that since the Nephilim hybrids are essentially proven to have survived the flood, that they may be directly connected to some of the powers that linger. Do you think there's any ties to that?
Yeah, actually, I do. I think. Well, I think that whether there are, they're not. I believe that these people believe that there are the people who do claim those bloodlines, and I think that's the kind of
Ah,
interesting thing is if you go back to the Tower of Babel story. So I didn't even mention him. So in the Sumerian idea would have been you would have had like Nimrod, Semiramis, and Tammuz. And so Nimrod was like this god king. And I believe maybe that could have been maybe the devil's progeny. Maybe that guy, maybe he literally was the devil's seed. And so it mentions later that Nimrod set up all these cities, all these kingdoms. And then if you think about it, what if those the Nephilim kings that kind of ruled afterwards were related to this one Nephilim king? And so I want to say if you go back and I read a couple books on it, there was one about the 13 bloodlines. There's also another one. It was just called The Illuminati by Jim Mars. And they were tying it back to that I believe it was the Rothschilds believe that they descended from Nimrod. Yes, which I mean kind of tracks. And
yeah.
also the Windsor family, so the royal family in Great Britain, and also the Bush family called themselves sons of Marduk. So sons of Marduk was like a Babylonian name for Zeus.
Wow.
So I mean, if you think about it, that's why if you do go into if you check the genealogies of all the U.S. presidents, they're all cousins. They're all like cousins of each other, and they're all descended from this one king in England named John Laughlin, who was the king when they established the Magna Carta and around that time. But yeah, like then if you check up like the genealogies of King Charles, he's related to Dracula, the historical man Vlad the Impaler. And so if you think about it, so they're related to him, and he's related to the King of England. That means all the U.S. presidents are related to Dracula. And what are
Wow.
the odds? Like, what are the odds? I'm saying that I think that's the idea of like a blue blood. Like it's this literally this different DNA, or at least they believe it is, that they're superior to us. And if they believe that they're from this Nephilim bloodline, they're literally saying they have a divine bloodline because it comes from heaven and not from here. So that makes sense why presidents are selected, they're not elected. That's
Yeah.
why you have like royal families and these certain people on this earth they feel by like divine providence, they have the ability and the authority to rule over the rest of us.
Wow. That's a wild concept to grasp.
Yeah. I mean it is, but it
Holy.
also kind of makes sense the way they treat
No, it
people and the
does.
way
Yeah.
they lord over people. Because yeah, the Nephilim kings would have been they would have been genetically superior, maybe at the beginning. And I think again, there was probably corruption in the bloodlines. And I think that's why there's a lot of kind of incestuous nature to them, is because they were trying to keep this bloodline. Because you really think about it, the first Nephilim, I believe, and this is maybe just my theory on it, makes sense that the first group of Nephilim would have probably been kind of like what you see with the Greek gods, the demigods. You have this angel procreates with a beautiful woman, and likely their offspring is going to be, the best of both of us. And then, but later, if they lose the ability to continue to kind of keep their seed a little bit more diversified, right? Then they have to say, oh well, as the more they have offspring, the more that the bloodline is dwindling in them. So their whole goal would be to keep it strong. So then they have to continue to have like an incestuous relationship, keep it in the family, and then that would begot genetic corruption. It would all kinds of deformities, and that's why it's interesting that a lot of the giants eventually are described as being, yeah, deformed, having like cyclopses and weird things like that. I wonder if that's where the kind of the more kind of, in the mythologies about these kind of just big dumb giants that are just have a hunchback or a second head or something like that, is
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it was all about, yeah, these things were, their gene pool was very shallow at one point.
Interesting. Huh. That's still mind blowing that it all kind of ties together, and you do have the absolute lineage if you believe that, right? Or
Hmm.
like you said, even if they believe it, that they're protecting that.
Well,
Wow.
yeah, I know that you even have like eventually those stories, and I've tried to really dial in on this, and it's hard to kind of say, but there's these WikiLeaks dumps that were saying that Hillary Clinton was looking for the tomb of Gilgamesh, and she was talking about like some kind of Nephilim thing in there, and so I think it's interesting that a lot of people have tied his mythological character of Gilgamesh, who was a 17-foot giant, to Nimrod. So people have
Mm.
wondered, what if they are trying to genetically grab some DNA from this and, yeah, through some kind of a mad science project, bring them back, or maybe strengthen their own DNA in some kind of way.
Huh. So you mentioned Bush, and this is kind of going to throw it off topic a little bit, but it's par for the course. There's a couple different concepts on why 9/11 happened. Obviously,
Okay.
we know it happened. We know there's conspiracies behind it and everything, but the theories of why it happened. We have oil. We lost control of oil at some point. We needed some reason to go to war in the Middle East to gain control of that oil.
Hmm.
We have another concept, and this is the one that I believe. Uh, and talking to some buddies that have been in the military, fought in Desert Storm and everything, they're like, "We don't know what the hell we're doing out here. We're wreaking havoc on people,
Hmm.
and it's all just forgiven." But at the end of the day, a couple of them who are religious based, they were stationed in areas where there was artifacts,
Right.
biblical that needed to be found, that were found at like around that time and needed to be protected.
Yeah. Hmm.
So what do you think about that? Do you think that like 9/11 and like, I mean, if Bush is a direct descendant of one of those bloodlines, right? And we found this information that we started this whole war on terror to go get those artifacts and protect this, but that was the grand cause.
Well, yeah. Obviously, I don't believe the mainstream narrative behind any of that stuff, but
Yeah,
I would
absolutely not.
I would say that what I find interesting is that they were supposed goal was to go to war in Iraq was because of weapons of mass destruction. Well, they didn't find any, but did they? Like, what if it was an ancient weapon of mass destruction is that they were looking for?
Ah.
And I want to say, and I can't directly remember exactly what it was, but I believe that around the first Iraq War with George Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, he there was some kind of discovery. I want to say in the Iraq region right then. They're finding ancient Sumerian tablets and things like that, like kind of really interesting things, but like what kind of importance do they have other than historical importance? So then this war breaks out. But specifically, I do remember one of the big conspiracies about the last one was kind of, it was around the time where supposedly somebody might have found the tomb of Gilgamesh. So this is around the same time. And what I found really interesting was this idea that strategically what the United States did when they invaded Iraq made no sense. Because what a typical kind of war strategy would be, that when you invade a country, the first thing you do is go destroy their army. Because then obviously everything else after that is cake, right? Because
Yeah.
then you can do whatever you want. But what they did was they went in there, and I think there was a skirmish, but then they took a beeline right to Baghdad. And then when they did that, shortly after that, there was some kind of looting of this museum in Baghdad, and all these artifacts were stolen. And I can't remember
Huh.
who was. I don't have the general's name or exactly what his position was, but I want to say like this guy did a news conference where he was saying that whoever looted this museum knew exactly what they were looking for, and they went into the basement and they took a lot of things, and he was calling it inside job. So it wasn't just
Ah.
random folks taking stuff from this museum, and yeah, they were taking Sumerian tablets and who else knows what.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned like, what would these artifacts have? Like, why would they matter? Who cares who discovers them, who protects them? But if these shadow powers that be are even protecting something as simple in in our minds as the seven mystical sciences, then to them that's of greatest importance. They need it.
Well, I mean, I believe lots of these secret societies, their main goal is gnosis, is knowledge of things. So as you said, you have these seven sacred sciences. And if all they got was a tablet that had knowledge of something, of who knows what. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously this knowledge was really important. And I do believe, and I think that's what kind of has really been a kind of focal point for me of understanding a lot of this stuff is that man was never stupid. So that the old knowledge likely was as important, if not more important, than anything we've got today. Is that I believe that if you do believe those megaliths were built by humans, they were still super smart. However, they built all these grand structures, million-pound stones and obelisks and things cut out of one giant thing. The laser precision of the things they did, I believe they had technology. So if you go
Absolutely.
back and you find tablets, maybe it discusses some of this. And if they can crack the code of what these things say, well, yeah, that knowledge is very, very powerful and important. So yeah, the truth is, us uninitiated. Well, for one, they try to dismiss the idea that these people were primitive hunter and gatherers way back in the day. But I think that all the evidence, the megalithic structures indicate the opposite. So yeah, I believe that kind of story, kind of that whole story about, when you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, is when they finally do find this relic of great importance. They just hide it from the public because
Yeah.
if the public knew about that the Ark of the Covenant was real, well then that would change people's perceptions of this world. So if they ever found an artifact that does not make sense to our understanding of our history, well then they most certainly would hide it. Even think about that movie. Do you ever see Stargate back in the day?
No, no.
It's a pretty interesting movie. It's all right, but the main, I won't spoil it too much for you. But if you watch the very beginning of the movie, they're pulling out, like they're in like in Egypt, and they're pulling up this kind of this giant Stargate. It's like it's ancient. It looks like it's made of stone. And so eventually, this is, and it's like there's like a news headline about it. But eventually, they figure out how to make it in modern times. Almost, it almost looks like CERN. They go in there,
Huh.
they found a ancient Stargate, and then they repeated some of the, maybe the symbols and some of the technology on it. And then eventually, they were able to go, through a Stargate, go to another place that resembles Egypt, another part of the universe. And it was just like, I just thought, is that kind of what they're showing you? Like, is that what they found? What if they found some kind of ancient version of something they've created today? Kind of like I
They're
said,
exposing the reality through theater.
they reverse engineered some kind of ancient relic.
Yeah.
You know,
No, that's
back then it was called magic, but now we call it science. But it's somewhere in the middle. It's actually what it is.
interesting. Yeah. No, I firmly believe that the ancient Egyptians, and kind of like you're saying, had power, they had technology. There's all the theories that the pyramids were like the powerhouses
Possibly.
of a lot of it, and that they even potentially had greater technological power than we do. And it kind of reset time in a sense. They got too advanced too quick. And that could be because of the godly information that was passed down. But hmm. So, how do you personally balance your faith in God with the awareness of all these dark patterns? It sounds like you diving into all this has really helped build a foundation to your faith rather than lead you astray.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I mean, I would say that I believe in a sovereign God. I don't believe that God lets the devil do anything that he doesn't allow him to do. Like the devil's not out there doing things and God's confused about it. It's like God, like think the book of Job. The devil has to come ask for permission to do what he's going to do. So I would say that leads you to believe that God is more powerful, not less. And then I do believe the Bible's true. So I believe that the victory in Christ is guaranteed. But outside of that, yeah, there's lots of mysteries. And I would say that most of these topics, and a lot of this is just theory. So, I mean, I'm just speculating on the things based on the information we have.
Yeah.
I would just say it just helps me form a worldview that makes sense in the chaos we're living in. Where, yeah, you do have a ruling class that seems to have a completely anti-humanistic perspective on things, where they rule over us, they treat us like cattle, and then they have a divine right to make decisions that are completely immoral. So it makes sense that when you do kind of research these mystery schools and you see all their symbols, they're all ancient symbols. They all go back way back. And so it is kind of like that. It's like the wink and the nod saying, yeah, we have information about your past. And so that's why it's kind of allowed me to be very cynical of the things I'm told by mainstream sources, because most of these sources are controlled by these same secret societies, these bloodline families, and they want us to be just smart enough to work the levers in the machine, but not smart enough to question kind of the prisons that they've created for us. But I would say that, yeah, I mean, through Christ, that there's a spiritual world that's more real than this one. And I believe that, yeah, ultimately the suffering here is only temporal. So I would say that, yeah, it absolutely just, I mean, I find it fascinating. I find it, the whole thing is, I find history more interesting. I find fiction more interesting because, as you said, they kind of reveal their methods through the fiction. It's kind of like the revelation of the method, the predictive programming. They kind of want to tell us, maybe so they get off the hook karmically, or they might just be telling us because eventually they'll say, "You should have known. You should have known that we were doing this." And yeah, I don't know. I just find it really interesting. I just think that the world makes more sense when you kind of have this understanding.
Absolutely. So for our listeners exploring these heavy subjects, how would you say they can stay rooted in Christ instead of fear? And kind of the concept that dabbling in these subjects isn't necessarily foul play or something that's against scripture by any means. Um, but yeah,
Well, well, I would. Well, then first and foremost, obviously, I would consider, if you're a Christian, I would say that you stay rooted in God's word. Obviously, you pray and you pray for discernment, and maybe you find out this might not be the subject for you. If it's not, because obviously a lot of the stuff that I've kind of done over the years is I have kind of dug down deep into the rabbit hole, and I've got sick finding some of the stuff that I learned. And it's not all things you need to know. But if you do want to know, I would say that if you're really, before you kind of run off and chase the apocrypha and the all the extra biblical texts, or concluding to potentially these Gnostic texts, you got to be really firmly, grounded in what the Bible actually says. So that's why I would say that here's your kind of true north, where it tells you, okay, I'm getting little off track because this actually starting to contradict the scriptures we have. But also, there's some good resources. I know that one of the first books I read, other than like the Genesis 6 conspiracy, I read The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. And that really kind of helped me kind of get an understanding of like the broader concepts of the spiritual things in the Bible. And I thought the way he phrased it, I really liked, is he said that the Bible was written for us, but not to us. And so he was
Mm,
saying, like, a lot of it's contextual, that's understanding. He also says, if it's weird, it's important. So if you read your Bible and you're saying that's a really odd thing that God did there, why was this in there? So I think it's kind of fundamental to understand the weird parts, because you get greater understanding of the canonical text we do have. But so then when you have that understanding, that you can read like books like Enoch, a lot of the fragments, I think in the versions of it, we have to question if it's been complete, or some of these parts have been kind of somebody else has filled in the gaps in this text. So other than that, I think the book of Enoch, especially first Enoch, second and third Enoch seem corrupted, but I believe that it is inspired. It's quoted by Jude in his epistle. It's quoted like verbatim. But with that being said, it's, even if you don't take it for as it's a Holy Spirit inspired, I think it's fundamental to understand the text, because like this is the context. Like I said, if we wrote a letter to each other today and we were talking about Trump, I wouldn't have to tell you the whole story of Trump for you to understand. Like I would already know that you would already know who he is. So we're not going to go into detail about everything. So it's important to maybe get texts outside the Bible to to gain a greater understanding of who these letters are written to and what their understanding at the time. So I think that that's where it's kind of fundamental. And I think then outside of that, once you kind of get understanding of like that, I'm not sure what's true other than what the Bible says. Outside of this, we can speculate. And I think if it helps you gain understanding, or it helps you gain a little more broader perspective on the text, I think it's a good thing. But again, it's not necessarily for everybody.
I see. Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense, especially because it really pushes against the grain of the mainstream narrative and kind of what's taught even in church today.
But I think it's important though, because like I said, you see like the phenomenon of the movies over the past bunch of years that these, like I said, I liked comic books, all these Marvel superheroes coming out, and if you can't, if you if you listen to this podcast and and you go watch one of those movies again, you'll probably gain perspective of like, wait a minute, these are gods from heaven like Thor, and then they're also these superhuman mutants and weird beings with supernatural powers. Is this a story that's been repeated over and over again? And the answer is yes. It's like the old gods are just the new Marvel superhero in tights.
The
It's like
context is
literally,
important.
yeah. So to
Super
kind of understand,
important.
like this is a story that were once mythologies to the Greeks, but now we just call it Marvel Studios. It's DC. It's all the same thing.
Yeah. Huh. Shoot. Well, to wrap this up, in Revelation 13, verse 16 through 17, John writes, as he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and might buy or sell, save he that had the mark of the beast.
Hmm.
Do you think we're living in the mark of the beast era right now? How far do you from this?
No, I actually don't. I actually don't. I don't. I do believe there's also a typology. I believe that that was a first century prophecy. I believe that there's actually strong indications that in the times of Nero, he set up this system where you would go into like the local town to engage in commerce, and you had to engage in this ritual where you put a mark of ashes on your hand or your forehead, and it was a thing if you couldn't buy or sell. Now that being said, I could be wrong, but I believe a lot of those prophecies have been fulfilled. But I believe there's also a typology that is repeated over time. You think about it says in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. What will be again. So it was like that if God's the same, which he is, the devil's the same, and humanity is mostly the same too. So we continue to make, the devil's tricks really haven't changed that much because man is still easily fooled by all of them. So I would say that it does seem like we are spearheading toward a one world government. That's at least the goal.
Yeah.
And the control system does seem like it could eventually be some kind of a digital currency that would come with some kind of a, I don't know, biotechnology marker, some kind of an electronic tattoo. I would say that that stuff is something I've talked about for a few years ago. I mean, it seems like that it's only a matter of time. We've often thought that, and I would say that. So, if I believe that some of those prophecies were fulfilled in the first century, does that mean I would get any kind of a mark that they're promoting now? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Anything that would change our kind of genetic code, which again, that's where some people have wondered that are they trying to find DNA from some kind of a Nephilim thing? And I've even heard like they were promoting through vaccines and shots that eventually they could make like superhuman people and you'd be immune to all kinds of diseases and things like that. I mean, would people would line up to get that? I
Oh,
believe.
yeah.
I mean, it would make sense to me that they would if it was all promoted with all the good without all the bad. But whether you believe that we're heading toward tribulation or not, the idea of a digital currency that contains some kind of a biomarker on yourself just sounds like slavery. It sounds like absolutely tyranny where they could through like maybe a social credit score they could shut down your ability to engage in commerce. That is like one of the most horrifying thoughts for a free person to hear. Like no. And that is kind of the irony. I just was talking with a friend about that. Isn't it kind of ironic that as you got the Illuminati eye over there, like kind of the eye of Horus, and you think about our dollar bill with that evil symbol on it, like that's our like last little symbol of freedom is cash, right? When
It's
cash
true.
goes away, it's like that yeah, like things will be it'll be really I mean, it's a really scary thought. And obviously I would say resist if you can.
So the world's not ending yet. But I do agree with you that we're definitely headed toward that new world government, one world currency thing.
Well, it does seem whatever's happening now, it does seem like this plan was really put into place. Maybe I mean it's probably been put into place a long time ago, but just say like the transformative times would have been like September 11, 2001. Obviously, you get into 2020 and the pandemic, and then what's heading toward now. It does seem like that things have accelerated towards something. I mean, that seems. I mean, I think everybody, no matter what side of eschatology you're on, would readily admit. So, is this the end? I don't necessarily think so, but I don't know either.
Yeah.
It does feel like that we're in, yeah, the Marvel, the end, Avengers end game. Like we're in the end game at some point. I don't know how long the end game is, but it does seem like we're heading toward that.
Absolutely. Well, JT, thank you for bringing your research and faith to the table today and sharing it with the listeners. Where's the best place that people can find you?
Yeah, if you liked anything you heard today, you can probably check me out on YouTube. That's where I put a lot of my content at. Obviously, I'm on lots of the socials. If you like short clips of things, I post clips of my podcast, and obviously I make short reels on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. And I have a podcast that if you like to listen to on the audio, you can check out JT's mixtape over on Apple or Spotify. But if you find me on anything, you can find my link tree. I'm pretty much on everything.
Linktree, perfect.
Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely link to your Linktree in the show notes. Well, thanks for listening to the Broken Truth podcast. Check the show notes link in the description to find JT's links. Until next time, pay attention, remain skeptical, because the truth isn't whole, it's broken.
In a world built on hidden histories and half-truths, we've only just begun to peel back the layers. Because what you've heard tonight was never meant to be known, but you were meant to find it. If you're ready to go deeper, leave us a review, comment your thoughts, share this episode, and step inside the archives. Join the inner circle, where the real evidence is kept. This is the broken truth, because the truth isn't whole, it's broken.